And Mendham. Okay, the way I see this is kind of, yeah, life is, by definition, like if you look at the universe before life, this is sort of a zero-sum game. But it's a rearrangement. So it's sums don't really happen. You know, if you have 500 apples or 500 pounds of apples, or they're always in a particular distribution that's being ignored by summing them up. You know, a barrel of apples rearranged, we still consider a barrel of apples. But physically, there is a difference, okay? That difference seems to give this gimmick of applying another dimension over time where we also invent these value systems. Yeah, we just plug them in arbitrarily. I'll talk about that in a second. But we have these value systems. And it's kind of like a physical trick, like it should almost be impossible with a zero-sum game. But look, energy is conserved as well, and also we know that heat goes from the warmer area into the colder area, right? Like that's not osmosis, but it's a similar kind of, you know, nature abhors a vacuum type of concept. And yet we finally figured out how to invent a refrigerator, and it's damn clever. And by using pressure and stuff, you can manipulate energy such that you can pump energy from a low energy area out into a higher energy place. But you have to put in a little bit of energy. And it's kind of like that with life. You have to put in a little bit of energy, but you can skim along trying to maximize the pleasure. Now, I think the mind wants this pleasure to be a zero-sum thing. Different zero-sum, right? Different domain than this other one we're talking about, related. But it wants to find almost equal measures. It wants to go to the world neutral and be able to find an equal amount of displeasure and pleasure, right? Because, for example, I just heard on NPR's story about this little girl that has Williamson's syndrome, I think it's called, and she is, you know, slightly mentally disabled, but mostly seems like an ordinary little girl. But she just walks up to strangers and tells them she loves them. She's very affectionate. She's trusting. And this, of course, is a very dangerous thing. There's a high incidence of abuse and molestation for girls of this, children rather, of this syndrome, evidently, according to this story. Because you don't want to be all blissed out. You want to come to the world neutral. However, you can eke out more pleasure than pain with that system. Why? Because over time you can pump a little bit of energy in, making it more pleasurable, right? So it's like when you woke up neutral, if you never, not cold, but just lukewarm on everything, then you should find an equal number of things you like as you don't like, as please you as displease you. But you put a little energy in, and you can pump up the ones that please you. Okay, now it is kind of arbitrary. No doubt we will soon, well, we've already done this to other animals, but, you know, be able to trigger pleasure centers, for example. So just pushing a button will do it. But humans might do that because we're stupid. But notice the DNA has not done that. The DNA has not just, it could just make you a blob that feels pleasure all the time. But the pleasure must serve a purpose, even if it's interpretational, even we're just interpreting something we would call a purpose, a pattern in nature that we would call a purpose. But I mean, it has to be for another reason. It can't be for its own end, or we would just be there stimulating ourselves. It looks like that a little bit, but we're not. They're plugged into things like, you know, eating that help survival. Even though that urge can make us overweight and stuff, it still helps survival. It's better than, you know, not ever being hungry and starving to death. And that's how those things are plugged in. So it's somewhat interesting, and this is what causes me to pause. Because by a lot of people's standards, you know, I love the natural world, or parts of it and everything, and overall I think it's great. I could say I love it, but it's not like I'm a big champion. Like if you were to say we're going to have to outsmart it, it wants this other thing. My interpretation of its purpose is that it's sort of malevolent. We've got to work against it. We're going to outsmart it. I would not interpret what you do as a result when you do outsmart it. I wouldn't call it outsmarting because nature led to that as well. But that's just semantic. You see, it's nature's not a god that is a jealous god. You know, if it's God at all. If someone accuses me of worshiping the natural world, since I'm a natural philosopher in my approach to things, I just have to say, well, it's a different kind of God than you're used to. It's not jealous. It doesn't want you to say it's the best. It knows that it's the worst and the best. It's the everythingist. So it too has a sort of a nature where you think, it probably collapses down to zero. But we as living things don't have to. And basically it's like this chart, this thing. So this is a graph of someone's life I had from my other thing, and the red areas are where it dipped below overall. This could be a chart of a culture too. So the culture was having mostly pleasure, then it mostly. The problem here is because of the individual thing, when the culture could be having a lot of pleasure, but maybe that's on the back of some people that are having a lot of misery at the same time. In other words, it's not fair to sum these together because some people are getting all the pleasure and some people are getting all the misery. So what you really need is a whole multi-dimensional data set and concept of these graphs are just slices. You really want every single one of these curves of every subgroup in a group to be positive. If you find a subset, a subculture of people that are having more misery, more red than the green during their lives, then you should address that. I think that's where we're going. Is that when we're talking about a personal, individual pleasure and pain, we can make this balance. And we can take the pleasure and pain as one person. But when we're a society taking pleasure and pain, or a world, a whole genetic culture of Homo sapiens taking in pleasure and pain, we need to make sure that all the groups are in the green. It's that simple. Now, the complicated parts are abound. Among them, people are pointing out, again, we haven't really addressed with this, material consequences. I think basically all of this adds up into how you perceive it. In other words, a person that's miserable because they're rich and safe and never have to work and can do everything they want to, and they entertain themselves and enjoy themselves, but they still consider themselves miserable because their mother didn't like them, or they didn't get a pony, or whatever. That really does make a red area for them. Okay, it doesn't have to be that way. They could be stronger, but they've chosen or whatever to let that be a red area. I think it does all come down to that. But as we hook many people together and cast across society, then we start to look for material causes, because that's what we have in common. We don't have the subjective interpretation that the color of paint in a room matters. Some of us have it, some of us don't. But what we have in common is need to survive, and the definition of material consequence based on survival. So that's where we I get pleasure from eating, but it's also from our survival. Okay, yeah, we need to make sure that there's a way for everybody to get food and partake in commerce in order to get food to survive. Everybody has to do that. So it's a social thing we might consider and realize when we're considering other people. We won't make any calculations thinking, well, those people don't eat food, or those people, that's their problem. Part of it might be their problem. But my point is, we're not going to ignore that that's a universal among humans need. Okay. So yeah, the zero-sum game, is just true in this one dimension. Ultimately, human pleasure and pain means nothing. This machine can be set up anywhere. The 0 point, where you don't have pleasure or pain, it could be set up anywhere. It could be set up anywhere. Humans, we set it up. We're very flexible what kind of environment it could go, and then it gets set up, and it wants to split the world into the pleasure and pain so that it can seek the pleasure and avoid the pain. It's just an algorithm. But it does work. It pumps. It's like an entropy pump. It does work. It pumps, meaning from the meaningless. I don't know how far that metaphor goes, but it does work. You can, by putting a little energy in, you can get more than the 50-50 split and skim above the surface of the water. And given millions of years, that adds up to huge amounts of positive sum. And yet I'm not saying the world's right now any better than you think it is, not at all. It's got some serious, serious problems. But this is meant to help us identify those problems and potential solutions.